The Carlisle room was dead silent. 200 of the city's wealthiest elites were staring at a man in a faded gray work shirt. His heavy canvas tool bag had just hit the marble floor with a deafening crash. Billionaire Richard Sterling sneered and adjusted his tailored tuxedo. He grabbed a microphone that was meant for his grand opening speech. "My $1 million gala is not meant for failures who smell like cheap grease." Richard's voice echoed harshly through the surround sound speakers. The crowd erupted into cruel, mocking laughter. But that laughter died the exact second the heavy oak doors at the back swung open. The United States Secretary of Defense walked into the room. Richard immediately dropped his smug expression and rushed forward with an eager smile. He held out his hand to greet the most powerful man in the building. The secretary walked right past him, without even blinking. He stopped square in front of the grease-stained electrician. He stood perfectly straight, snapped his heels together, and delivered a rigid military salute. "If you believe that a person's true worth is never defined by their clothes, I want you to do something for me right now. Type the words, 'I don't fear failure, I choose kindness,' in the comments below, as a promise to yourself." This story is about a man named Elias. Elias wasn't always pulling overtime shifts to fix fuse boxes in corporate basements, but life has a way of completely resetting your coordinates when you least expect it. His wife passed away 3 years ago, after a long illness. Since that terrible day, it had just been him and his 8-year-old son, Leo. They lived in a cramped, drafty 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city limits. It wasn't a mansion, but Elias worked tirelessly to make it a true sanctuary. Out on their tiny rusted balcony, he had built a beautiful little hydroponic garden. They grew fresh tomatoes, vibrant basil, and crisp greens in repurposed buckets. Right next to the plants sat a sturdy glass tank, where they raised a few colorful fish. Leo absolutely loved that little balcony. He would sit out there for hours, watching the fish dart around the clear water. Elias would stand beside him, with dirt on his hands and a smile on his face. It was their quiet, peaceful escape from the loud and unforgiving world outside. Elias always made sure to teach Leo the things that actually mattered in the long run. He would kneel down, look his son right in the eye, and speak from the heart. "Failing at something doesn't make you a failure, Leo. The only real tragedy in this world is refusing to dust yourself off and start over." He wanted his boy to have a genuinely wealthy mindset. He wanted him to understand that true wealth is about resilience, positive energy, and unshakable character. Elias was a man who lived by his words and never feared starting from the bottom. That is exactly why he took the emergency maintenance call at Sterling Tower on a Friday night. He needed the extra cash to buy Leo a real telescope for his upcoming birthday. Sterling Tower was a brand new $50 million smart tech building. Tonight was its grand unveiling party, packed with investors, politicians, and celebrities. Elias was told to slip in through the service elevator and fix a flickering circuit on the VIP floor. He did his job quietly, efficiently, and completely out of sight. But on his way back to the service elevator, a frantic waiter bumped hard into his shoulder. The collision knocked Elias's heavy tool bag right out of his grip. Wrenches and screwdrivers scattered across the pristine white marble floor of the main lobby. That was the exact moment Richard Sterling stepped up to the podium. Richard hated anything that ruined his perfect, highly curated aesthetic. He looked down at Elias, with absolute disgust burning in his eyes. He didn't see a hardworking father trying to buy a birthday gift for his son. He only saw a dirty, insignificant obstacle standing in the way of his flawless event. After Richard insulted him over the microphone, Elias didn't yell or throw a punch. He just calmly knelt down and started picking up his scattered tools, one by one. He possessed a quiet charisma and an inner peace that money could never buy. And then, the Secretary of Defense walked in, and delivered that shocking salute. The entire room of billionaires and socialites stood frozen in stunned silence. The secretary lowered his hand and spoke in a voice that commanded absolute respect. "It is an honor to see you again, Captain." Richard Sterling's face drained of all its color as he stared back and forth between the two men. He stammered and tried to find his words. "Mr. Secretary, this man is just a filthy maintenance worker." The secretary turned his head slowly and locked eyes with the arrogant billionaire. "This man is Elias Vance, former commander of the Air Force Pararescue Division. 10 years ago, my helicopter went down in a hostile combat zone during a massive firestorm. Elias jumped into a burning fuselage and carried me 2 miles through hostile territory with a broken rib. He doesn't just fix wires, Mr. Sterling. He keeps people alive when everyone else has given up." The silence in the room was so thick, you could choke on it. Elias simply nodded at the secretary, his expression remaining completely humble and grounded. He didn't care about the fame, the past glory, or the shocked whispers of the elite crowd. He just wanted to finish his shift, get his paycheck, and go home to his son. But as Elias reached down to grab his last heavy wrench, something made him stop. His knuckles brushed lightly against the decorative aluminum wall panel near the elevator shaft. He felt a very faint, irregular vibration humming beneath the metal surface. He paused and closed his eyes, relying on his deeply ingrained combat instincts. He took a slow, deep breath through his nose. Beneath the expensive smell of designer perfume and roasted duck, there was something else. It was the sharp, undeniable metallic scent of burning ozone. It was incredibly faint, but Elias knew exactly what it meant. The core electrical system of the building was silently overheating behind the walls. If you also believe that real value always hides beneath a dusty surface, please support our channel by hitting that subscribe button right now. Elias stood up slowly and looked directly at the building's massive central air conditioning vents. The smart AI system hadn't triggered a single alarm or flashing red light. The multi-million-dollar sensors were completely blind to the disaster that was currently brewing. Elias turned to Richard Sterling and spoke in a calm, authoritative tone. "You have a massive thermal overload happening in your main breaker room right now. You need to evacuate this lobby immediately before the panel blows and starts a massive structural fire. If you have ever had the courage to speak the truth when everyone else was doubting you, drop the words, 'I don't fear failure, I choose kindness,' in the comments to claim your strength." Richard let out a loud, condescending laugh that echoed across the quiet room. He pointed a manicured finger right at Elias's chest. "Are you completely out of your mind? This building is controlled by a $50 million artificial intelligence network. If there was a fire, my screens would be flashing red, and the sprinklers would be on. I am not going to ruin my press event just because a glorified handyman thinks he smells smoke." Elias didn't argue, didn't flinch, and didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his bag and sprinted straight toward the restricted basement doors. 2 heavy security guards stepped in front of the stairwell to block his path. Elias didn't even slow down. He dropped his shoulder and shoved past them with a raw, practiced force. By the time they recovered their balance, he was already taking the concrete stairs, 3 at a time. The deeper he went into the sub-basement, the hotter the air became. It felt like walking directly into a furnace. The heavy steel door of the main electrical room was completely locked down. The digital keypad glowed a peaceful, reassuring green. The multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence was happily reporting that everything was perfectly normal. Elias grabbed a heavy titanium crowbar from his bag and wedged it into the doorframe. His old rib injury flared up with a sharp, blinding pain as he threw his entire body weight against the steel. The electronic lock snapped, and the heavy door swung open. A thick wall of toxic black smoke immediately poured out into the hallway. Elias pulled his shirt over his nose and forced his way inside. The massive central breaker panel wasn't just overheating. It was completely melting down. Thick yellow sparks were showering the concrete floor like fireworks. Elias squinted through the burning smoke and immediately saw the problem. The heavy-duty commercial voltage regulators hadn't failed by accident. They had been entirely replaced with cheap, counterfeit plastic components. Someone in Sterling's inner circle had siphoned millions of dollars from the construction budget. They had left the building's core absolutely defenseless against a power surge. The AI couldn't detect the fire because the counterfeit sensors were sending fake baseline data to the mainframe. In less than 3 minutes, the melting plastic would hit the main gas line. The entire 50-story glass tower would become a massive vertical chimney of fire. Elias knew he couldn't wait for the fire department. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the blistering heat radiating off the metal floor. He had to manually sever the main feed and reroute the emergency suppression override. His hands were shaking from the sheer adrenaline and the toxic air burning his lungs. If you have ever had to fix someone else's mess while they took all the credit, type, "I don't fear failure, I choose kindness," in the comments. He grabbed a pair of insulated heavy-duty cutters. He carefully traced the thick, pulsing copper wires through the blinding smoke. One wrong cut would send 10,000 volts straight through his heart. He closed his eyes for a split second, picturing his son Leo smiling on their tiny balcony. Never fear starting over, Elias whispered to himself. He squeezed the heavy steel handles with every ounce of strength he had left. A massive blue arc of electricity shot across the room, throwing Elias backward against the concrete wall. The entire building plunged into absolute darkness for one terrifying second. Then, the emergency backup generators violently kicked on. The chemical suppression system finally recognized the severed connection and roared to life. Thick white foam and halon gas flooded the electrical room, instantly suffocating the sparks and lowering the temperature. Upstairs in the grand ballroom, the emergency sirens were finally screaming. The strobe lights were flashing, and the panicked elites were being ushered out the emergency exits. Richard Sterling stood frozen near the podium, staring blindly at the flashing red lights. His perfect, invincible, smart building was shrieking in distress. 10 minutes later, the lobby was swarming with federal agents, fire chiefs, and paramedics. The Secretary of Defense stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with the lead fire investigator. Elias slowly walked up the basement stairs, covered in black soot, chemical foam, and sweat. He was limping heavily on his right leg, clutching his ribcage. Richard Sterling pushed through the crowd of paramedics and stared at Elias. The billionaire's expensive tuxedo was ruined, and his arrogant sneer was completely gone. The fire chief turned to Richard with a look of pure disgust. "Your vice president of operations gutted the safety protocols to embezzle construction funds. The sensors were rigged to report normal temperatures, while the panels literally melted into slag. If this man hadn't manually severed the core, this tower would be a mass grave right now." Richard's knees suddenly gave out. He slumped against the marble reception desk, burying his face in his trembling hands. The man he had called a filthy failure had just saved his life, his company, and his entire legacy. Richard looked up at Elias, his voice cracking with genuine shame. I am so incredibly sorry." Elias didn't demand an apology or gloat over the broken billionaire. He just picked up his canvas tool bag from the marble floor. "You should really pay more attention to the foundations, Mr. Sterling. A building is only as strong as the people holding it up." The Secretary of Defense stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Elias's shoulder. "The Department of Defense is severing its data contracts with Sterling Tech, effective immediately. However, the Pentagon is currently looking for a new director of physical infrastructure security. The starting contract is 7 figures, and I want you running the entire division. Elias. Elias looked at the secretary, a slow, genuine smile, finally breaking through the soot on his face. He didn't need to worry about working night shifts in damp basements ever again. He had finally secured the financial freedom he had always promised his son, but Elias didn't stay for the press conference or the flashing cameras. He quietly walked out the glass doors into the cool, refreshing night air. 2 hours later, Elias quietly unlocked the door to his small apartment. He had showered off the soot and changed into a clean flannel shirt. He gently shook Leo awake and carried the sleepy 8-year-old out to the balcony. Sitting right next to their little vegetable garden was a massive, professional-grade brass telescope. Leo's eyes went wide with absolute wonder as he looked through the lens at the glowing moon. Elias stood behind him, wrapping his arms around his son's shoulders. He had faced the absolute worst of human arrogance and didn't let it change his heart, because true strength isn't about how loudly you can yell into a microphone. It's about having the quiet courage to do the right thing when the lights go out. If you believe in the power of staying humble and working hard, leave the words, "I don't fear failure, I choose kindness" in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of what truly matters. See you in the next video.